For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, the morning started like any other along the Normandy coast. A light, wet fog lingered over the English Channel, wrapping the world in a gray quiet. The air felt chilly, carrying the usual smell of salt and damp soil. It was just past 5 in the morning. Another shift, another day of tense waiting, but through his binoculars, as the first touch of dawn tried to pierce the horizon, the sea started to shift. It was not the waves. It was not a storm front. It was something unbelievable. A dark streak emerged where ocean met sky, a blur that just kept expanding, clarifying, and spreading. This was not a fleet. It was a city of steel, a drifting metropolis, emerging from the fog and into the records of time. At that instant, before one Allied soldier touched the sands below, before the globe even learned names like Omaha or Utah, he grasped that the Reich faced certain ruin. To understand the shock of that dawn, you must enter the mind of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From Norway's shores down to Spain's edge, German builders had created the Atlantic Wall. It stood as a chain of concrete and metal, packed with weapons, a barrier no assault could breach. At least, that was the story. In the views of German top leaders and the tales told to troops, it proved the Reich's might. But Oberleutnant Richter, a career soldier and survivor of the Eastern Front, knew the gap between stories and truth. At 32, he recalled an earlier Germany and had been forged by the war's heat. He stayed practical, watchful, and truly weary. His post commanded an artillery group with sturdy Czech-made cannons set in concrete shelters. A few miles back from the shores the Allies would soon label Omaha. From his lookout spot, a concrete bunker dug into a tall cliff, he held a wide view of the ocean. Day by day, he and his team practiced. They figured shooting paths, cared for their weapons, and gazed at the gray, blank waves. The chatter always circled the assault, the day X, the key moment. But when might it arrive? And more vital, where? German intelligence felt sure the chief strike would hit at Calais, the nearest spot over the Channel. It made sense. The 15th Army, most of Germany's power in the West, sat ready there. Normandy seemed a minor area, perhaps a target for a feint, but not the core action. This formed a huge planning error, and it came by design. It stemmed from a brilliant Allied deception effort named Operation Fortitude. The Allies built a phantom army under General George Patton, complete with fake tanks, dummy radio traffic, and double agents feeding false reports straight to Berlin. The trick worked perfectly, and it kept Normandy's guards dangerously thin. Richter's group, the 352nd Infantry Division, ranked stronger than many nearby, but it remained a faint echo of the top units that had taken France 4 years before. It mixed battle-hardened survivors from the East, like him, with a bigger share of very young teen draftees and older reserves. They showed courage and loyalty, but they lacked the assault power of 1,940. They served as holders charged with keeping a front stretched way too far. The Atlantic Wall itself looked more like a patchwork quilt than a firm barrier. Many bunkers stayed unfinished. Minefields had holes. The great distances meant even a stronghold could get cut off and bypassed. Richter understood this. He had spotted the paths local farmers still took, the blind areas in the shooting zones. He held a career soldier's doubt about their odds against a real strong push. In the weeks before June, the strain felt alive. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, assigned to boost the barriers, had moved like a storm. He called for millions of mines and thousands of sharp metal obstacles set on the sands. The troops named them Rommel's asparagus. Rommel grasped a fact that Berlin's top command seemed to overlook. If the Allies escaped defeat on the shores in the first 24 hours, the Western War would end in loss. Allied air strength would rip apart any German reinforcements heading to the coast. The opening day stood as the sole day of importance. But on June 5, the skies worsened. A gale arrived with strong winds and rough waters. The German weather team boldly stated that an assault would prove impossible for days. This outlook let many high officers ease up. It explained why Rommel himself was not even in France. He had headed home to Germany for his wife's birthday. The gale would guard them, or so they believed. What the Germans did not know was that Allied meteorologist group Captain James Stagg had spotted a brief gap in the storm. A narrow window of calmer weather, just long enough for the crossing. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, made the boldest call of the war. They would go. So as Richter kept watch in the early chill of June 6, the feel stayed normal. The gale had passed, but the ocean remained rough. No one expected trouble. He faced east when he first noticed it. A spark. He lifted his strong Zeiss binoculars and sharpened the view. His heart, which had pulsed in the calm beat of a night guard, started to pound against his chest. It was not a spark. It was vessels. Not a patrol group. Not a raiding party. Hundreds of them, and behind them, hundreds more. He scanned his binoculars side to side. Everywhere he aimed, it matched. The ocean no longer showed gray waves. It formed a solid mass of dark, threatening shapes. What Richter was witnessing was the largest seaborne invasion ever assembled in human history. Operation Overlord had brought together 6,939 vessels, 4,126 landing craft, 1,213 warships, 736 support ships, 864 merchant vessels. They carried 156,000 troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, France, Poland, Norway, and a dozen other nations. Behind them waited 2 million more soldiers, staged across southern England, ready to pour into France over the coming weeks. This was not just a military operation. It was the combined industrial might of the free world, floating on the English Channel. Richter's hands trembled, but his training held. He barked orders down the speaking tube. His gun crews sprang to action with the discipline of men who had drilled for exactly this moment. The first artillery round left the barrel with a crack that split the morning air, then a second and a third. The rounds wailed over the waves. Richter followed them through his binoculars, a rush of professional pride mixing with his dread. He saw towers of water burst amid the fleet. A hit, then another. His team excelled. They shifted their aim, shooting with a steady rhythm, and for a short time, they struck true. Richter saw a direct strike on an American destroyer, the USS Corry. There came a burst of orange and a cloud of black smoke. While some accounts suggest the vessel might have hit a mine as well, from Richter's position, his weapons had claimed first blood. The ship tilted, damaged, and later sank. A shout rose from his team. For a few moments, it felt like a real fight. It felt like their training counted. But the feeling fled fast, because after the target fell, the fleet did not scatter. It did not slow. The gap in the formation simply filled. The endless rows of vessels kept advancing, an iron tide that would not stop. His weapons fired over and over. But for each vessel they might trouble, 100 passed safely through. Richter felt a deep wave of helplessness wash over him. He was a man with a bucket trying to drain the ocean. He looked beyond his own shell, splashes, and saw the wider picture. The Allied battleships, vessels like the USS Texas, USS Arkansas, and HMS Warspite, now swung their massive guns toward the shore. The USS Texas alone carried 10 14-inch guns. Each shell weighed 1,500 pounds and could travel 13 miles. Then came the answer. It began as a low growl from across the waves. He saw bursts of light from the great warships, like a distant thunderstorm on the horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him started to rip apart. The ground began to heave. Towers of dirt erupted from the fields. The steady, methodical process of breaking the Atlantic wall had begun. Where was the German response? Where were the armored divisions? Where was the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the skies and saw nothing but Allied aircraft. Fighters, bombers, transports. They ruled the air completely. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed perhaps 300 flights in all of France. The Allies flew over 14,000. For every single German plane in the sky, more than 40 Allied aircraft flew. The cause was not a shortage of German bravery. It was the factories. German doctrine called for armored counterattacks to throw any landing back into the sea. But the nearest armored unit, the 21st Panzer Division, sat frozen by confusion and the demand for a direct order from Hitler's headquarters. And Hitler was asleep. His staff refused to wake him. When the panzers finally moved, they moved without air cover, straight into skies dark with Allied fighter bombers. Typhoons, thunderbolts, and Mustangs fell on them like hawks on mice. The armored columns shattered before reaching the front. It struck Richter in that moment, with his own guns still firing and the naval shells raining down around him, that this was not a battle. It was an erasure. The Allies were not trying to outfight him. They were trying to remove him. This single personal grasp of overwhelming force shaped the entire Normandy campaign. The story of how industrial power crushed battlefield tactics remains one of the most layered and gripping chapters of the war. As the naval bombardment grew stronger, something in Richter's thinking changed. The tactical side of his mind shut down. It got replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He no longer saw ships and planes. He saw the system behind them. He saw the factories. Through his shaking binoculars, he gazed past the warships and pictured in his mind the assembly lines of Detroit. He imagined the Ford plants at Willow Run, producing B-24 bombers at the rate of 1 per hour. He pictured the Kaiser shipyards in California, launching a Liberty ship every 42 days. He thought of the women and men on 3 shifts, around the clock, feeding this beast of production that now floated before him. The logistics of this assault, the ability to supply hundreds of thousands of men across a hostile shore, was not a miracle. It was the plain outcome of industrial output on a scale the world had never seen. The Allies had built an artificial harbor, codenamed Mulberry, towed it across the channel in pieces, and assembled it off the Normandy coast. They had laid fuel pipelines under the English Channel itself, a project called PLUTO, Pipeline Under the Ocean. They had manufactured specialized landing craft by the thousands, each designed for a specific task. This was war as engineering, and Germany had no answer. Then came the armored vehicles. Richter knew the reputation of the German panzer divisions. The Tiger tank and the Panther were superb machines, feared by every Allied crew that faced them. A single Tiger could destroy a dozen Shermans in the right conditions, but that edge formed a strategic dead end. Tigers and Panthers were complex, costly, and agonizingly slow to build. Germany produced only 1,347 Tiger tanks in the entire war. For each terrifying Tiger that left the production line, the Allies built dozens of simpler but brutally effective Sherman tanks. In the full year of 1944, the United States alone produced over 29,000 armored vehicles. Germany's best monthly output never passed 2,000 of all types combined. The Allies planned not to win armored duels through quality. They planned to bury the panzers under a mountain of steel. This was the new reality. This was the industrial math of defeat. All the speeches about willpower and ideological strength melted before these numbers. Nazi doctrine had promised that a united, determined people could overcome soft democracies. But here stood the proof that ideology could not stop a bomber. Willpower could not sink a battleship. Richter felt a deep, almost sacred grief. He and his men were fine soldiers. They were trained, disciplined, and prepared to die. But they were not being outfought. They were being outnumbered on a scale that defied comprehension. They had entered a contest that was already decided. He and his team, the entire German force in the West, were a well-crafted sword facing a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome was certain before the first blow fell. He thought about the propaganda posters and the firm promises back home of final victory. It was all a lie. Not just a political lie, but a mathematical one. The German high command must have known. They must have seen the production figures. Yet they had sent him and millions of others to fight a war they could not possibly win. As the sun rose higher, the nightmare became reality. The naval bombardment reached a peak, a steady rolling thunder that never stopped. The concrete of his bunker shook, dust falling from the ceiling in streams. Through the observation slit, Richter saw the first waves of landing craft reach the shore. Higgins' boats lowered their front ramps, releasing American soldiers into the chest-deep waves. The machine guns in the German strongpoints along Omaha Beach began to fire, cutting into the ranks of the first men ashore. From his elevated position, Richter could see the terrible scene unfold. The surf turning red, the bodies piling up at the waterline. Men pinned behind steel obstacles, with nowhere to go but forward into the guns or backward into the sea. The German 352nd Infantry Division extracted a terrible price. For a desperate hour, maybe two, it seemed like the defense might hold. The Americans on Omaha were stuck, bleeding, and close to breaking. General Omar Bradley, watching from the cruiser USS Augusta, seriously considered abandoning Omaha Beach entirely and diverting all forces to the other landing zones. But then the industrial math appeared again. Allied destroyers, spotting the slaughter from offshore, did something bold and extraordinarily brave. They sailed straight toward the land, some closing to within 1,000 yards of the beach, scraping their hulls on sandbars. They aimed their guns point blank at the German bunkers, delivering close fire support that changed the flow of battle on Omaha. Commanders like Captain Harry Sanders of the USS Harding made the call on their own initiative, without waiting for orders. This was democracy in action, individual officers making bold decisions because their system trusted them to act. At the same time, strange new machines began to appear. Richter watched as amphibious trucks, the DUKWs, seemed to drive straight from the ocean onto the sand. He saw tanks crawling ashore, some fitted with huge flailing chains designed to detonate mines. These were Hobart's Funnies, specialized armored vehicles the British had invented to overcome exactly these kinds of defenses. There were tanks that laid bridges, tanks that threw flame, tanks that swam. The Germans had nothing similar. The scene on the beach below transformed from a contest into a steady process of destruction. German strongpoints were blinded and crushed by naval shells, tank rounds, and bombs, one by one. On Omaha Beach alone, the 352nd Division would lose around 1,200 men that day, a massive share of its fighting strength gone in hours. Richter's own battery now became a primary target. Shells landed closer and closer. A direct hit on one gun position sent a fireball into the sky. Another gun was destroyed. His telephone lines went dead. He stood isolated, his command shattered. He looked up at the sky one final time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the ocean, the first wave of landing craft was replaced by a second, and a third, and a fourth. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently, a conveyor belt of men and materials that could, it seemed, run forever. The Allies would land roughly 156,000 troops on D-Day. Within a week, that number would pass 326,000. Within a month, over 1 million Allied soldiers would stand on French soil, along with 177,000 vehicles and 586,000 tons of supplies. The fight for the beaches still raged, but the outcome was already sealed. It was just a matter of time and blood. The war in Normandy would grind on for another 2 brutal months. The battles in the hedgerows would prove savage and costly for both sides, but they would change nothing in the final equation. Each German tank destroyed was a loss that could not be replaced. Each Allied tank lost was replaced by 3 more, rolling off the production lines of Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago. Each German soldier who fell left a gap in the line that could not be filled. For every Allied casualty, fresh divisions waited in England, trained and equipped and eager to cross. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived past that first day, the rest of the war was just a long, grinding conclusion. They fought on, driven by duty, by fear, by loyalty to comrades, or by a love of country separated from the regime that ruled it. But the hope for victory had died. It had vanished in the dawn light of the 6th of June, 1944. We often picture the end of the Third Reich as a slow, painful collapse, ending in the battle for Berlin. But for the men on the Atlantic Wall, the end came in one terrifying instant of understanding. It came the moment they saw a fleet that filled the horizon, a sky darkened with enemy aircraft, and a force that was not merely an army, but the full crushing weight of the modern industrial world. It was a new kind of war, one decided not in the courage of soldiers, but on the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away. And for one German officer, staring through his binoculars at an ocean that had turned to steel, it was the dawn he understood with absolute certainty. It was over.